Judge Grayson thought he was sentencing a clueless teen. Until the defendant started dismantling the case. Like a seasoned lawyer. The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse felt thick. Almost suffocating. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, murmuring among themselves as they watched the scene unfold. The defendant's table looked too big for the young man standing beside it. Hands in his pockets. Chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. Jalen Dawson, 19. Accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges were serious. But the way Judge Walter Grayson looked at him made it clear. The real trial had nothing to do with the law. Grayson leaned back in his chair. Fingers drumming lazily against the polished wood of his desk. He peered down at Jalen over the rim of his glasses. His lips twisting into something between a smirk and a sneer. You think you're some kind of legal expert? His voice carried a dry amusement. This isn't a debate club, kid. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor, they were all in on the joke. Jalen didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Not this exact one. He never planned on standing here as a defendant. But he knew the courtroom like the back of his hand. While other kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head, arguing imaginary cases with himself. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years. And Jalen had grown up listening to the stories. She brought home how prosecutors cut corners, how judges played favorites, how some defense attorneys barely tried. He absorbed everything. By the time he was 14, he could break down a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another kid in trouble. Let's make this quick, the judge sighed, flipping open the case file. I have a golf game at 2. The audience chuckled again. But this time, something shifted. Jalen's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. Because Grayson had just made his first mistake. But the courtroom hadn't noticed yet. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, rose from his seat with the air of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his voice carried that rehearsed confidence of someone who had delivered the same speech 100 times before. Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle. A 2022 Audi A6. Reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself. The words landed with weight. The crowd in the gallery shifted, whispering among themselves. On the surface, it sounded damning. A stolen car. A chase. Running. Judge Grayson glanced at Jalen over the rim of his glasses, then turned back to Carrington. Go on. The prosecutor walked toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding. That Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance. He turned, locking eyes with Jalen for the first time. But let's be honest. What kind of victim runs from the police? The tension in the room thickened. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Jalen didn't blink. Carrington continued, flipping through a stack of papers. Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book. Grayson exhaled through his nose, nodding. Sounds straightforward to me. And for most people in the room, it probably did. The case was clear-cut. A stolen car. A chase. An arrest. But Jaylen had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks. Still, he stayed silent, watching, waiting. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. All right, let's hear the defense's response. He turned to Jaylen's lawyer, a public defender named Lisa Thornton, who had barely said 3 words since stepping into the courtroom. She stood up, shifting nervously. Your Honor, my client. Jaylen placed a hand on her arm. A silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down. And for the first time, Jaylen spoke. I'll be representing myself. Your Honor. The room went completely silent. Grayson stared at him, clearly amused. You'll what? Jaylen's voice was calm, steady. I'll be defending myself. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Carrington's smirk faltered for just a second before he let out a sharp laugh. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing when Jaylen took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. Jaylen straightened his posture, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to submit a motion to dismiss. Grayson raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. On what grounds? Jaylen stepped toward the bench, his voice unwavering. On the grounds that the prosecution's case is built on circumstantial evidence and procedural errors. Carrington scoffed. Oh, this should be good. Jaylen turned, looking directly at the jury. The prosecution claims I was caught red-handed. But if we actually examine the evidence, we'll see a different picture entirely. He picked up a folder from the defense table and walked toward the jury box. First, let's talk about the fingerprints. The prosecution states that my prints were on the wheel. What they fail to mention is that there were multiple sets of prints, not just mine. He handed the report to the first juror, who glanced at it before passing it down the row. In fact, Jaylen continued, my prints were only found on the outer rim, while another set, a full set, was found on the gearshift, the door handle, and the steering column. Carrington's jaw tightened. Jaylen turned back to the judge. Meaning, Your Honor, someone else was driving that car before me.